It's the subterranean maker here, and just look at this beautiful table. Everything isn't perfect though. I made a lot of mistakes while building this table. After every project, I like to reflect on the lessons that I've learned and how I would do it differently. And that is exactly what this video is about. I'll be talking about my design mistakes, the mistakes made with material choices, my own techniques and what I would do differently, and finally, the good, the bad, and the recommended tools. Number 1. The design mistakes I've made. I think the biggest mistake I've made in the design was to disregard what others have done. There is no shame looking at other designs and drawing inspiration from them. So lesson 1 is reinvent some of, but not the whole wheel. On this table, the apron runs along the border. As this is a work table, you'll often want to clamp things to the tabletop. This may become a laborious task if your clamp doesn't have the capacity to reach over the apron, especially if the apron is larger. So my suggestion would be to move in the apron about an inch or an inch and a half. On the topic of aprons, the aprons on this table are pretty short. I would suggest to make them taller because this would result in a stronger table. Obviously our screws won't be able to go through the apron anymore, but that brings me to the next change I would make. The method of joining we used was to drive a screw through the one piece of wood into the next. If you still prefer to do this, I have a tip about it in the tooling section of this video. See the description for a timestamp. Anyway, if I had to redo it, I would use glue from the start, and I would use it in conjunction with pocket holes or dowels. This design comment I have isn't so much of an error, but a suggestion. I chose the height of this table to be comfortable for me to stand at and work. As a reference, I'm about 1.9 meters in height. You must keep your use case in mind when choosing a height. If you'll be sitting or you are physically shorter, you may want to make the table lower. There are standardized guidelines for picking a height. Another nice add-on would have been to add a parcel shelf. There are 2 reasons for doing this. The first, and obvious one, is that you'll have storage space. The second one is that the table legs are then connected, which strengthens the table. See the previous video on how this adds strength. Numero 2. Choosing the wrong materials. Perhaps the biggest mistake I made with the lumber itself was to not inspect it more thoroughly. As we saw in the second video, this middle board that makes up the tabletop is cupped. If we had picked a straight board, it would have adhered much better to the reinforcements, resulting in a stronger table without adding material or cost. In some areas of the table, like here on the legs, the screws could have been longer, but as I mentioned before, pocket holes or dowels would have been a better choice. The Gorilla wood glue worked very well. I should have started using it early in the project. The Watco wipe-on polyurethane was also a good choice, although I have a couple of tips on how to use it coming up shortly. Apparently you can mix up your own wipe-on polyurethane by diluting normal polyurethane with mineral spirits. It is said to be more cost effective, and I'll probably try that in the future. With that said, let's move to part 3, my techniques. It's okay to wipe on the polyurethane in a circular motion, but once it's deposited onto the surface, wipe in one direction to smooth it out. Also use small squares of rag. The larger the rag is, the more finish is absorbed into it and consequently wasted. Once the rag is saturated, you'll be tempted to squeeze it to release some of the finish. This is okay as long as it isn't close to the edge. That is because the release might cause pooling or running like it did here on my tabletop. The next lesson learned comes to sanding. Once the table is assembled, it's hard to sand because you can't reach in the corners unless you buy a separate tool called a corner sander. I wish I had sanded the pieces before assembly. Because I didn't do this, I have rough patches. These patches catch the rag and fray it. The fibers are then deposited onto the surface and consequently get embedded in the finish. When it comes to the wood glue, I personally feel I should have been a bit more liberal with the application. There's no use in skimping here, your final product will just be weaker. The last thing I would change was my careless drilling. Because I didn't keep the drill upright and steady, the holes weren't always perpendicular to the wood. The exit holes are then offset to one side and not nicely in the middle. Before blasting through on full power with the drill, look at the drill from the side and from the front and ensure that it's perpendicular and upright in both planes. Staying with drilling, let's move to topic number 4. The good, the bad, and the recommended tools. I should have used a spur wood bit, also known as a brad point bit, instead of this high-speed steel one. Doing so will greatly increase the accuracy of your drilling because the point doesn't drift off the mark as the high-speed steel ones do. This is the tip I mentioned if you plan on joining the lumber in the same way as we did in the build. Like I mentioned, I would use pocket screws or dowels as the mechanical fasteners in the future. I suggest buying jigs for this. A jig positions and guides your drill, making your cuts repeatable, more accurate and neat. A combination square really is a must, especially if you plan to cut by hand. These squares ensure that your marking lines are perpendicular to the side of the workpiece and are straight. Another must for cutting by hand is a miter box. Even though the name suggests it's for cutting miters, they usually have cross-cutting slots as well. I really thought that I would be able to keep the saw straight and upright, but holy hell was I wrong. No matter where your skew cut is, it will cause alignment and stability issues. Use a miter box. The saw I used wasn't ideal. A carpenter's saw would have been better. The best would have been a power tool such as a table or a miter saw. They can be had for 100 to 120 Canadian dollars from Home Depot. So if you have the cash, pull the trigger on those tools. I was really happy with the random orbit sander and the drill was okay. I'll release tool review videos of these tools in the future and link them in the description of this video. Now that was a lot of information. I've learned so much from this project and would like to continue to produce content like this to help others learn. If you'd like to support the channel, just continue to watch my videos here. You can also subscribe here and leave comments and likes down below.